There are shifting BEE requirements in the mining charter as well, which was first drafted in 2002, came into force in 2004, and then was changed in 2010. There's been a recent audit of compliance, and the Department of Mineral Resources is now claiming that mining companies are generally not compliant with the revised mining charter. But it also matters a great deal that the charter was unilaterally changed by the department, because the new rules are much harder to comply with, and there's great uncertainty as to quite what they mean, particularly in the context of the first empowered, always empowered, once empowered rather, always empowered rule. There was a variation of it in the original mining charter. It indicated that the ongoing consequences of past BEE deals should continue to be taken into account, even if BEE investors sold out. The government is now saying that's not so. The moment the BEE investor sells out, the company must do another mining deal, and the Chamber is seeking clarity from the courts on what the status really is. But the upshot, oops, sorry, let me go back. Why did I get there? I meant to be there. Sorry. Great uncertainty about mining titles, because the penalty for non-compliance with the charter is cancellation of your mining right, and nothing could be a greater deterrent to investment in the mining sector. Right, now let me go into these things. Sorry about getting out of sync here. South Africa is way down on the Fraser Index. This looks at the attractiveness of different mining countries to international investors. And in the latest one, we come 64th out of 122 countries. And yet we have probably the largest non-oil mineral reserves in the world. So it's an extraordinarily bad performance. Employment in mining is down severely, from 693,000 in 1990 to 419,000 last year, and it's no doubt going to drop further. According to the National Development Plan, the mining sector in South Africa shrank by 1% a year during the 2000s, even as the mining sectors in other mining countries expanded by 5% a year in that period. And that means, of course, those countries have much more fat to see them through the lean years, which we are now all experiencing, and South Africa has less. I want to turn very briefly to land reform. In a nutshell, agriculture contributes only 2.5% to GDP, so the sector really is too small to be used to try and overcome rural poverty. But the goal with land reform is nevertheless to transfer 30% of farmland to black South Africans, which means about 26 million hectares. Some 7 million hectares have been transferred, but at least 73% of those restitution projects have failed, according to the minister. And we also know that in the most recent round of resolved land claims, only 8% of successful land claimants actually wanted land to farm. The rest wanted to have the cash. And this is not surprising in a society which is rapidly urbanizing, where most people would prefer to leave the rural areas, come to the cities, have land for housing, and find jobs. And this was to some extent acknowledged by the Minister Gugelian Kinte in 2013 when he said, we no longer have a peasantry, we have wage earners now. Nevertheless, we're going to expand land reform. So I'm sure most of you are aware there's a new land claims process. The government expects something like 380,000 new land claims, which could cost 180 billion rand to settle, and the chiefs could be the main beneficiaries. The land ceilings being mooted by the government were initially put at 12,000 hectares. They're already coming down. Mr. Nkwinti in his budget speech spoke of 1,000 for small farms, 2,500 hectares for medium farms, and a maximum of 5,000 hectares for larger farms. There's also the 50-50 proposal, that 50% of every farm should go to long-serving farm workers, an arrangement which the African Farmers Association of South Africa has also described as unworkable. There's to be no more freehold title for people living in the communal areas. There was at least some possibility of that before, but now the government has set its mind against it. 1 hectare per household, is the maximum that people might be able to own in their own right. So in general, black South Africans will not have land ownership. It's the state that's to be empowered. More and more land is to go to the state and to be controlled by it. And this is now also very evident in the Agri-Land Framework Bill. This is a very long title. It's the Preservation and Development of Agricultural Land Framework Bill, in fact, of 2014. It was put up for comment by the end of May this year. And the idea in here is that all agricultural land will automatically vest in the custodianship of the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, or DAP. This is the same wording as in the MPRDA. So it does at least create a risk that we might have the same sort of outcome. In other words, effective expropriation without compensation, at least for land which is in excess of those ceilings, when those ceilings are brought in. At the moment, the government is saying that if farmers have excess land, then that will be expropriated. But it's possible that at that point, DAF will say, but we have custodianship of the land anyway, and the farmer has lost many of the powers of ownership in any event. But it's not an expropriation. There's deprivation from the farmer, but there's no acquisition of ownership by the state, only of custodianship. So no expropriation and no compensation. Farmers will have a right to farm under this bill, which the minister will regulate. And we don't know quite how the minister will regulate it, but there is a possibility that the right to farm could in time be made dependent on having a lease with DAP, with BEE requirements which might perhaps shift over time, as has happened with the mining charter. One important rationale of this bill, of course, is to protect farmland from particularly encroachment from mining land and also urban encroachment. But many of the present powers of ownership will be reduced at least. People won't be able to enter into 10-year leases or to sell their land to foreigners without the consent of the state. And getting that consent will depend on getting approval from a host of new bureaucratic bodies, and it will be very time-consuming and very costly to jump through all the hoops that will be set up. And in essence, it seems that high-potential cropping land is supposed to be used solely for food or food crops for human consumption, and that in fact it won't be possible to have that rezoning for commercial or residential or other purposes, that rezoning will only be permitted if the use is still a suitable agricultural use. So what we see really in essence is that all the black economic empowerment rules are being tightened up. On employment equity, there are much bigger fines and there are also fewer defences. And critically, the onus of proof has changed. In the past, the Department of Labour had to prove that an employer was not making reasonable attempts to comply with the Act. Now the employer has to show that his failure to meet the racial targets is reasonable in all the circumstances. And that changed onus could be quite difficult to meet. Under the BEE Amendment Act, there'll be big fines and possible jail terms. The BEE codes will altogether be much harder to fulfill, and especially for qualifying small enterprises, the ones with annual turnover between 10 million rand and 50 million rand. There'll be a lot of pressure on smaller firms in particular to acquire 51% black ownership so as to retain their contracts with larger enterprises, and that, to my mind, is indirect expropriation. They're the new Treasury regulations under which the weighting will be